The wind pulled at Lily Brennan's braid as she hurried across the wide porch of the Dusty Hollow Ranch, her boots clattering against the sun-bleached boards. Summer had arrived with a vengeance, baking the fields golden and stirring up dust devils that spiraled along the fence lines. The ranch, nestled against the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, had once thrived under her father's care. Now it stood at the brink of ruin, its barns sagging, its herd dwindled to a fraction of what it once was. She tucked a fraying strand of hair behind her ear and scanned the driveway. Empty. No buyers, no visitors, no miracles riding in. Only the worn mailbox stood sentinel by the gate, leaning sideways as if even it had given up. Lily clenched her jaw and turned back to the house. No time for hope. Hope didn't pay overdue taxes or fix broken fences. Inside, her younger brother Caleb coughed from the kitchen, a harsh, racking sound that made her stomach twist. The boy was tough, stubborn as a mule, but the recent bout of pneumonia had taken the starch out of him. The doctor's visits, the medicine, it all cost money they didn't have. As she poured water into a kettle, a sharp knock rattled the door. Lily wiped her hands on her jeans and opened it, blinking into the fierce sunlight. A figure slumped against the post, one hand clutched tight against his side, blood oozing through his fingers. "Ma'am," he rasped, his voice low and rough. "I." He staggered forward. Lily caught him under the arms, the sudden weight nearly dragging her to the floor. "Easy now," she muttered, her heart thundering in her chest. She caught a glimpse of him then, a battered cowboy hat, a square jaw flecked with stubble, storm-gray eyes clouded with pain. Whoever he was, he needed help and fast. She half-dragged, half-carried him inside, lowering him carefully onto the worn couch. Caleb peered around the corner, wide-eyed. "Get the first aid kit," Lily barked. The boy nodded and scrambled away. Lily peeled back the man's blood-soaked shirt and grimaced. A nasty gash ran along his ribs, deep and ragged, as if he'd tangled with barbed wire or worse. His breathing hitched when she pressed a clean cloth to it, but he didn't cry out. "You're lucky you made it this far," she said under her breath. His lips twitched, almost a smile. Caleb returned, clutching the battered metal kit in both hands. Lily thanked him and set to work. She cleaned the wound as best she could, the man's muscles flinching under her touch, stitched it with trembling fingers, and wrapped his side in tight, neat bandages. When she was done, he lay pale and sweating but conscious. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, the silence stretching long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, finally, a voice rough with fatigue. Jack Carter." It meant nothing to her, just another drifter passing through, maybe caught up in some trouble, not her business. She stood and wiped her hands on a towel. "You can stay here tonight," she said reluctantly, "till you're strong enough to ride out." Jack gave a slight nod of thanks before slipping into a restless sleep. Lily watched him for a long moment, unease prickling at the back of her neck. She had enough to worry about without dragging a stranger into it. Still, something in his face, an exhaustion that went deeper than the wound, stirred a reluctant sympathy. She shook it off and turned back to the kitchen, steeling herself for the evening ahead. Tomorrow she'd start making calls again, begging for work, for time, for mercy. The ranch needed saving, and no battered cowboy was going to change that. What Lily didn't know was that Jack Carter wasn't just another broken man drifting through town. He was the very one who could decide the fate of everything she fought to protect. And he'd come here carrying more than scars. He carried secrets. Morning spilled across the ranch like a slow tide, washing the worn wood and brittle grass in thin light. Lily cracked open the door to check on her unexpected guest. Jack was still there, stretched awkwardly across the couch, his hat tipped down over his eyes. His chest rose and fell in shallow, steady rhythm. She hesitated, then moved toward the kitchen. There was too much to do to linger. Fences broken along the north pasture, a leaking roof on the east barn, and the bank looming over them like a hawk over a rabbit. By the time Caleb shuffled in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Lily had set a pot of oatmeal on the stove and pulled out the battered ranch ledger. Columns of numbers glared back at her, bleak and unforgiving. "Is he gonna stay?" Caleb asked around a mouthful of apple. "Just until he's strong enough to leave," Lily said without looking up. She didn't want Caleb getting attached. They couldn't afford more heartbreak. But as the day unfolded, Jack didn't leave. He didn't even stir from his place until late morning when Lily, arms full of laundry, nearly dropped the basket in surprise as she found him standing in the doorway, swaying slightly, his face drawn tight with pain. "You shouldn't be on your feet," she said, sharper than she intended. "I can't just lie around," Jack muttered, voice rough. "You've got enough on your plate." He moved slow but stubborn, limping outside to lean against the porch railing. For a long while he stood there, silent, eyes scanning the brittle fields, the weathered barns, the splintering fences. Something unreadable passed across his face. Then he asked the last thing she expected. "You need a hand." Lily blinked at him, caught between suspicion and a flicker of hope. They needed help, badly. But hiring a ranch hand wasn't in the budget, and trust wasn't something she handed out like lemonade. Still, she measured the set of his jaw, the way he cradled his side but didn't complain, and against her better judgment, she nodded. "Fine," she said, "but you work light, doctor's orders." Jack gave a crooked half-smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." The next few days unfurled under a broiling sun. Jack moved carefully but determinedly, fixing broken hinges, patching fence posts, stacking firewood. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer excuses. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone used to pulling his own weight. In return, Lily found herself softening, almost despite herself. She caught Jack once or twice watching Caleb with something like tenderness when the boy proudly showed off his slingshot skills. Another time, when a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, Jack helped her tarp the hay, his movements quick despite the obvious strain on his injured side. At night, when the wind moaned through the cracks in the old house, Lily sometimes heard him pacing the floorboards, restless as a caged animal. She didn't ask what haunted him. She had her own ghosts to wrestle. But Jack's presence slowly changed the rhythm of things. There was less silence around the dinner table, more laughter from Caleb, a little less dread tightening Lily's chest each morning. Still, the bigger problems loomed. Late one evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, Lily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter from the bank. She didn't notice Jack at first, hovering in the doorway, his face shadowed. "You're in trouble," he said quietly. She jumped, the paper slipping from her hands. For a second, pride flared up hot and defensive, but it faded as quickly as it came. There was no use pretending. "Yeah," she said, voice rough. "The ranch is going under. My father, he took out loans when he got sick. I've been trying to keep it afloat since he passed, but it's not enough." Jack stepped closer, his gaze sharpened like a man weighing options. "How much time you got?" "Not enough," Lily said, folding the letter into a tight square. "Auction date set for the end of the month." Silence filled the room, heavy, dense. Jack's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking along the side of his face. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that made her chest ache. She offered a tight, brittle smile. "Not your burden." But she didn't know how wrong she was. Jack Carter had come to Dusty Hollow Ranch with more than injuries. He carried orders, a mission. He was supposed to survey the property for the investors who aimed to scoop it up cheap at auction, developers eager to turn the land into luxury retreats. He hadn't planned on getting hurt. He hadn't planned on meeting Lily Brennan. And he sure as hell hadn't planned on caring. Now Jack faced a choice he hadn't been ready for, one that grew heavier with each passing day. Loyalty to the life he'd built. Or loyalty to something he hadn't dared hope for in a long, long time. A home, a family, a second chance. Jack kept to his word. The next morning, before the sun had even shaken free of the horizon, he was already moving across the fields with slow, deliberate purpose. Lily watched from the porch, arms folded tight across her chest. She hadn't asked him to stay, hadn't begged for help, but there he was, hammering a sagging fence post back into place as if the ranch were his own to save. Maybe it was the way he worked without complaint, or the way he checked on Caleb's cough when he thought no one noticed. Maybe it was the quiet, unspoken understanding that hung between them. Whatever it was, Lily stopped questioning it. She picked up a bucket and headed for the chicken coop. By mid-morning, Caleb had dragged Jack out to the back lot. chattering excitedly about the old roping dummy their father had rigged up years ago. Lily caught sight of Jack tossing a lasso with an easy, fluid motion, coaching Caleb through the loops with a patience few men had ever bothered to show the boy. She should have been working, hammering through her endless list of tasks, but something about the scene rooted her to the spot. Watching them felt like stumbling across a memory she hadn't lived yet, a vision of a life that might have been, if the world had been a little kinder. Later, when the shadows stretched long over the fields, Lily saddled the battered bay mare and rode out toward the northern edge of the property. Jack caught up with her halfway, astride a wiry gray gelding he must have borrowed from the neighboring Benson ranch. She opened her mouth to protest, but the look he gave her, steady, unshakable, made her close it again. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the horses picking their way along the worn cattle trails. Lily pointed out landmarks as they went, the bent cottonwood where her mother used to hang a swing, the dry creek bed that turned to a raging torrent during spring floods. "You grew up here," Jack said, not as a question but a quiet observation. "All my life," she answered. Her hand trailed along the rough bark of a passing tree. "Wasn't always easy, but it was ours." He nodded, and for a moment, the silence between them was thick with understanding. They crested a ridge, and the full sweep of Dusty Hollow spread out before them. Rolling fields, scattered trees, the crooked line of the old cattle fence tracing the horizon. "It's beautiful," Jack said, his voice low. Lily felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and blinked them away fiercely. "Doesn't pay the bills." They turned back toward the ranch as the sky bruised purple with twilight. Lily didn't see the black pickup until they rounded the last bend. It was parked by the barn, dust still curling around its tires. She stiffened instantly. Jack must have sensed it because he slowed his horse too. Two men stood by the truck, both in pressed jeans and clean boots that had never seen a hard day's work. One wore mirrored sunglasses, despite the fading light. "Stay here," Lily said tightly. Jack swung down from his horse with a wince, but followed a few paces behind her anyway. The taller of the two men greeted her with a wide, false smile. "Miss Brennan, Jason Peel, representing Nevada Development Partners." "I know who you are," Lily said, her voice clipped. Peel's smile tightened. "Just wanted to stop by, see if you'd had time to reconsider our offer." Lily crossed her arms, not selling. Peel's companion, a stocky man with a clipboard, glanced around the property with obvious disdain. "Wouldn't blame you if you did. Place is falling apart." Jack shifted behind her. Lily didn't have to look to know his jaw had gone hard. Peel gave an exaggerated shrug. "Market's tough, Miss Brennan. This land's only gonna get harder to sell once the bank moves in. We're offering a fair price. Generous even." "I said no," Lily snapped louder this time. Caleb's face appeared in the window, watching. Peel's expression darkened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. "Well, just think on it. Time's running out." He tipped an imaginary hat and climbed back into the truck. The engine growled to life, and the dust they kicked up coated the porch steps as they sped off down the drive. Lily stood frozen for a moment, fists clenched. "You all right?" Jack asked quietly. She turned to him, her face set. "They're circling like vultures, waiting for me to stumble." Jack didn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to memorize the way she stood there, stubborn and unbowed against the world. And in that moment, a silent vow tightened inside him. He couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not from this. That night, Jack sat alone by the corral, the stars wheeling overhead in sharp, cold brilliance. His side throbbed, his head ached, but it was the weight of guilt that pressed hardest against his ribs. He had a decision to make. The kind that changed everything. When the sun rose again, Jack Carter wouldn't just be another wounded drifter looking for shelter. He'd be the man willing to fight for a future he hadn't even known he needed. And for the woman who, unknowingly, had already begun to save him. Jack woke before dawn, the sky still a deep indigo stitched with the first threads of light. Dusty Hollow lay in restless quiet, the air heavy with the thick scent of dry earth and hay. He moved through the house without waking Caleb or Lily, gathering what little he had: a battered satchel, his worn boots, his resolve. He rode into town alone. Silver Creek was little more than a blink-and-miss-it collection of old brick storefronts and dusty streets, but it had a bank, a county clerk's office, and most importantly, the man Jack needed to see. He tied the horse outside Brewster's diner and stepped through the creaking door. The place smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon, and in the corner booth, leaning back with all the casual arrogance of a man who thought he owned the world, sat Rick Danvers. Danvers was the middleman between the developers and the small-town properties they wanted to carve up like pies. He spotted Jack immediately and grinned wide. "Jack Carter," he drawled, "was starting to think you ran off." Jack sat across from him without invitation. "I'm out," he said. Danvers's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "Out. I'm not finishing the survey, I'm not filing the report. Find someone else." Danvers leaned forward, dropping his voice. "You signed on, Jack, you don't just walk away." "I didn't sign on to gut a family's life out from under them." Danvers's smile slipped away completely now. "You getting soft." Jack didn't blink. "Maybe." Danvers laughed, a hard, brittle sound. "You think you can just disappear back to that busted-up ranch? Think that girl's gonna thank you when the bank takes it anyway?" Jack stood, his shadow cutting across the cracked vinyl table. "Maybe she will, maybe she won't, doesn't matter." Without waiting for a reply, Jack turned and left, the diner door swinging shut behind him with a bang. Outside, the sun was climbing fast, washing the street in cruel gold. Jack squinted into the light, feeling a strange kind of freedom burn through his veins. For once, he wasn't running away from something. He was running toward it. Back at Dusty Hollow, Lily stood in the barn, wrestling with the ancient baler that had picked the worst possible time to die. Her hands were scraped raw, grease smudged up her arms, but she kept at it with grim determination. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. Jack rode up, dismounted stiffly, and crossed the yard toward her. "You're back," she said, trying and failing to sound indifferent. He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Had some things to settle." Lily leaned against the baler, exhausted. "If you're looking for a way out, I wouldn't blame you. No money, no future, nothing here worth sticking around for." Jack looked at her then, really looked, at the stubborn lift of her chin, the tired slump of her shoulders, the fierce spark in her eyes that refused to die even as the world closed in. "You're wrong," he said quietly. Before she could answer, Caleb's voice rang out from the porch. "Miss Lily, the lawyer's here." Her heart plummeted. She shot Jack a stricken glance and took off at a run, Jack close behind. A dusty sedan idled by the steps. A man in a rumpled suit climbed out, clutching a thick envelope. He introduced himself as Mr. Howard from the county clerk's office, his voice dry and apologetic. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, Miss Brennan," he said, "but the bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings. You have until the auction date, 2 weeks from today, to settle the full balance. After that, the property will be sold." Lily's mouth went dry. "How much?" she whispered, and Howard named a figure that made her knees weaken. There was no way, no amount of odd jobs or desperate calls would cover that. Howard offered her a tired smile and handed over the paperwork. "I truly am sorry." As the car rolled away, dust swirling in its wake, Lily stood frozen, the papers limp in her hand. Jack reached for her, hesitated, then set his hand lightly on her shoulder. "I'm not letting this happen," he said fiercely. She turned to him, anger and despair blazing in her eyes. "What can you do, Jack? Unless you've got a suitcase full of cash hidden under that hat, there's nothing anyone can do." Jack didn't answer. He just gave her shoulder a squeeze and walked back toward the house, something set and determined in every line of his body. That night, after Caleb had been tucked into bed with a coughing fit that left him pale and sweating, Lily stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the cooling air. Jack joined her, silent. For a while they said nothing. The stars stretched overhead, cold and indifferent. Somewhere a coyote howled. Finally, Jack spoke. "There's a way," he said, his voice almost a whisper. She turned to him, hope warring with caution. "I can buy you time. I have contacts, resources. I can put up a bond against the property. It's not enough to erase the debt, but it'll hold the auction off." Lily stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because you deserve a fighting chance. Because this place matters. Because you matter." The words hung between them, raw and exposed. Lily's throat tightened painfully. She wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't his fight, but the truth was she was too tired to keep standing alone. Slowly, she nodded. Jack's face softened, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The first fragile thread of trust wove itself between them. Not built on promises, not built on pity, built on something harder, something truer. A partnership, a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, a way forward. The following week blurred into a stretch of long, bone-tiring days and even longer nights. Jack threw himself into the work, fighting alongside Lily with a relentless focus that left no room for doubt. Together they patched fences, mended leaking roofs, sold off old equipment, and drove into town to scrape together supplies they could barely afford. Jack kept his word. He contacted a lawyer in Carson City who owed him a favor, and within 3 days the bond paperwork was filed with the county clerk's office. It bought them breathing room, just enough to finish the fight. Lily tried not to think about what Jack must have sacrificed to make it happen, tried not to ask how deep his debts now ran because of her. Every time she looked at him, something inside her tightened, something she was afraid to name. Jack didn't press her for answers. He didn't make speeches or promises. He simply stayed, steady as the mountains that cradled the ranch, fighting beside her as if her battle was his own. The night before the auction deadline, Lily found herself standing by the paddock fence, staring out at the fields shimmering under the light of a waxing moon. Jack stood a few feet away, tossing handfuls of oats into the trough, his movements easy, unhurried. "I don't know how to thank you," she said into the hush. Jack leaned against the fence, the lines of his face carved deep by the silver light. "You don't have to," he said. "You already did." She frowned, puzzled. "You gave me something I didn't even know I needed," Jack continued. "A reason to stay, a reason to fight." Lily swallowed hard, the truth pressing up against her chest. "You could have walked away," she whispered. He shrugged, a small, broken gesture. "I've done enough running." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them thick with everything they hadn't said. Then quietly, Jack reached out and took her hand. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a kiss in the rain or a dramatic confession. It was something stronger. A beginning. The next morning, the auction was called off. The bond Jack had filed stalled the foreclosure proceedings just long enough for Lily to finalize a desperate agreement with a local co-op to lease grazing rights on part of the north pasture. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough to save the ranch for now. Enough to keep the Brennan name tied to Dusty Hollow a little longer. Jack stayed. There was no big conversation about it, no formal arrangement. He simply carried his things out of the spare room and into the old bunkhouse behind the barn, fixing the roof and wiring in electricity with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. Caleb followed him like a shadow, soaking up everything Jack taught him, from mending tack to reading weather signs in the clouds. Some nights after the work was done and the dishes put away, Lily and Jack sat on the porch steps, sipping coffee and watching the stars rise. They talked sometimes about little things, his time riding fence lines down near Tucson, her stubborn old mare who refused to be retired. Other times they just sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Summer slowly faded into fall. The fields turned gold and brittle. The first frost dusted the fields white and glittering. One evening, after a long day gathering the last of the hay into the loft, Lily found Jack waiting for her by the barn. He was holding something in his hand, a small, weathered leather pouch. "I never told you why I was really here," he said, his voice low. She watched him, heart thudding in her ears. "I came to scout the property. For developers," Jack said. "I was supposed to file a report. Recommend they buy it up cheap after the foreclosure." Lily stared at him, every muscle in her body locking tight. "I didn't," Jack said simply. "I couldn't." He held out the pouch. Inside were the surveyor's notes, untouched, the evidence he had refused to turn in. "You saved this place, Lily, not me," he said. "I just chose the right side finally." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You could have destroyed us," she whispered. "I could have," Jack agreed. "But I didn't, because you and Caleb, you're not just fighting for a piece of land, you're fighting for something bigger. Family, legacy, home." Lily stepped forward and closed her hand over his. "You're part of that now," she said. Jack's breath hitched. He looked at her like a man seeing solid ground for the first time after years at sea. And then, without hesitation, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was careful, aching, real. A slow collision of two battered souls who had been carrying their wounds for too long. Jack wrapped his arms around her, grounding her against him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lily let herself believe they might actually be okay. Not perfect, not easy, but real. When they finally pulled apart, Jack leaned his forehead against hers and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." Neither was she. Dusty Hollow wasn't saved completely. There were still battles to fight, seasons to weather, debts to be paid. But they would face it all together, hand in hand. Home wasn't just a place you fought to save. It was the people you chose to fight for. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it was the ones who stayed to fight for you.